Hey, it's Jackson, and today we're going to talk about the role of an intelligent designer, which we may think of as God or a higher power or something like that. The role of that in creating the universe and particularly creating human beings and conscious awareness. But important thing to clarify as we start this video, I am not here to advocate for that necessarily. In fact, just by putting a video out there with this title, I worry a little bit because people will see that and be like, oh, God, is this guy like this crazy, like devout, like super religious guy that's trying to like force you like, God is real and you need to worship my God? No, 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 no. Not trying to do that. In fact, this video was inspired by a fairly scientific, or at least very rigorous book written by a former Google engineer called Solve for Happy. And he talked about kind of the philosophical debate of maybe, just maybe, there is some evidence to point towards some sort of higher power or intelligent design in the universe. So again, I'm not saying I agree with that, but I think we could have a really interesting kind of philosophical, psychological debate here in this video where we talk about the evidence for and against this. And we may also consider the role of this because ultimately our beliefs, right, our perception of reality shapes our happiness in a lot of ways. And so we'll talk about some of the implications there, but I want to again start with a sort of not biased. Again, I am not saying I don't think I even do yet necessarily believe in some intelligent designer, what we might call God or creative force like this. I go back and forth on it. But I think weighing that side versus the sort of evolution and random chance and evolving of kind of particles in space into consciousness, right? Again, it just poses, I think, really fascinating questions. And these are the type of big life questions that I think as a society we should do more of. And they really make for wonderful and interesting conversations if you bring an open mind to them, as opposed to what? Just being like, oh, how about the local football team? How about this weather we're having? Boring. No one wants to talk about that. So let's get into it. What I want to present is kind of the thought experiment and the logic that would make the case for maybe there is something more than meets the eye. Maybe there's sort of a creative force or an intelligent design that's operating on some level in the universe. And it really starts with this logic, okay? There's no way to prove with 100% certainty that something does not exist. It's kind of just like a logical impossibility. I mean, because think about it. You would have to observe like every single atom in the entire universe to prove for sure that something does not exist. If I say, hey, I think there's unicorns out here somewhere. You're like, Jackson, we haven't seen them on Earth. And I say, well, maybe they're at the bottom of the ocean, where we've only explored less than 1% of the bottom of the ocean, actually. Or maybe they're in some faraway galaxy, right? Like, there's no way to say it. We say it's unlikely that there's unicorns. I'm sorry, if, spoiler alert, maybe break your heart out there. Okay? It's unlikely, but we can't say for sure that there is not. And so similarly, it's hard to say for sure that there is not a God or a higher power or a spirit. Certainly it's hard to find evidence that confirms it, but that doesn't mean it does not exist. Okay, so that's the first idea. But now, building off of that, you can think about it the other way. Well, what are the odds that we got to be what we are today and conscious and society and all of this stuff? What are the odds that that could have happened without any design, without any intelligent or creative planning? Okay. And so this, again, I was coming at this from a skeptic. I tend to be fairly scientific and sort of in the middle with all of these sorts of creation and religious type questions. But I thought this was some really interesting data if you have an open mind to it, okay? So the amount of just random chance that would have had to happen to go from a bunch of just particles and energy and matter in space to a big bang, to a planet Earth, to the first self-organizing systems, to cells, to animals, to humans, is really pretty incredible. You think about, like, if you just roll a dice, 1 out of 6 times it's going to land on any number. But every time you add in another dice, it kind of increases the probability exponentially. So say you have two dice and you're trying to say, okay, what are the odds that both of them are a 6? Okay, well, if you're rolling one die, it's 1 out of 6. If you roll 2 dice, what are the 2 dice? Gosh, what are the odds that both of them are a 6? Well, it would be 1 over 6 times 1 over 6. So that's 1 over 36, which is like very small decimal. You add in another one and you get this 1 out of over a couple hundred. And so we have to think, all right, well, what are some of the probabilities at work here? So now Brian Greene is an author, and he uses this kind of thought experiment to explain it. Think about this. There's a novel called War and Peace that's about 1,200 pages. It's a classic, but it's very long. And he says, imagine you stood at like the top of a building, you had 1,200 pages printed out in a stack, and you just sort of threw them up in the air, threw them off the side of the building. They all fall down to the ground. And not only do they land in a perfect pile, they land in the exact right order of 1,200 pages in a row. Not a single one is out of place. You're like, that's pretty much impossible, right? Well, he makes the analogy, again, it's a kind of a thought experiment. He says, that is very similar to what you say if we say, hey, we just had this universe with a bunch of electrons and atoms and protons and neutrons and dark matter, and out of that just randomly popped out, modern world with human beings. It's a lot like that. So, okay, that's interesting. But there was a more specific series of calculations that again, I'm not fully arguing one side or the other, but got me kind of thinking about this. So our bodies are made up of proteins, which essentially fold into various shapes that are needed to kind of fit into our body and give us the structure of our body and the process and kind of these organic machines that we are, right, for everything to work properly. So you can imagine, right, if you have this protein that it could fold this way, or it could fold in half this way, or it could fold corner to corner, or it could kind of fold in that double corner, or it could go, into more of a ball. Like there's all these different ways it could fold. So one scientist, Nobel laureate, Christian Anfinsen, actually calculated this. Said if you think of all the ways a simple protein could fold, there's pretty much like only a couple, only a few that end up in the right configuration that's needed to sustain life, okay, biological life. And so if you were to just run through all these different ways of it can fold this way or this way or this way or this way, this way, all those different probabilities, to arrive at a place where it would randomly fold into the shape that it did to work for biological life, it would take 10 to the power of 26 years. So that's 10 with 26 zeros after it. The problem is, this is more than 1 trillion times longer than the calculated history of the universe. So again, I'm not trying to say that I for sure agree with this, but it at least got me start to think like, maybe it's true. Like, maybe there's some sort of design or design principle, because it does, when you look at those calculations and then think about how to just get from that folded protein to more complex cell with a cellular membrane and cellular respiration, and then become an animal, a fish, and then a reptile, and then an animal, and like what? It's kind of crazy that all of those random fluctuations could have built up to that in the history of the universe, which is relatively short when we think about cosmological terms. So that's an interesting place to start. And, in this book I referenced, Solve for Happy, he draws the analogy of this. He says, imagine, what would you say if you walked up to me and you saw I had this new iPhone, and you say, oh, where did you get that? And you said, well, I actually just found it out in my yard. It was buried in the sand, and I think it just was made by 4 billion years of random chance and evolution. You'd probably say, well, it seems impossible. I read some quote that said that, what is hydrogen? And it said like, hydrogen is a simple, single atom chemical that if left alone for a few billion years will become people. Like, again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. That it says, okay, that the pure random chance and random fluctuations idea does not seem totally plausible. So, where does that leave us? Well, it starts to open up again an interesting debate. So is there some higher power or sort of grand design that helps all these different dots connect? And I want to offer one other perspective on this, and then we'll talk about potentially some implications for happiness. One other one that I find fascinating comes from a book I can actually grab. The Systems View of Life by Fritjof Capra. He wrote another book called The Web of Life, which I was just looking for. And this might be an interesting reconciliation. On one hand, you can imagine the extreme of there's this God up there who is planning everything out and setting everything into motion, and maybe the other extreme, which is just it's like random stuff in space, a bunch of particles moving around, and eventually, boom, a human pops out of that. There may be an interesting kind of unifying bridge, and that has to do with the idea of self-organization. Now, this is something that's observed. This is scientific. Now I'm talking. This is not philosophy. This is pure science. That the universe or substance or matter in the universe tends to exhibit this weird property where certain systems will just spontaneously emerge into higher order complexity. One example of this is a Bernard cell, which is you have a certain chemical reaction and you heat up this liquid, and all of a sudden this random surface starts to form into these neat little hexagon type cells. Okay, and so they all self-organize. And it's referring to a tendency where in certain chemical systems, as you add more energy into it, the system suddenly jumps up to a higher order of complexity. So in that case, you had this random liquid mixture, suddenly, boom, crystallizing into these little cells. Even crystalline structures in nature are kind of an example of that, where the law of entropy, which says things tend to go into the most disordered form possible, these systems kind of defy it because it turns into this highly complex structure, and then at certain points it'll suddenly jump up into a new higher order level of complexity. And so in this book, Fritjof Capra is his name, a physicist and ecologist, he kind of teases this out and says it seems like as if the universe almost has this tendency to constantly reach out into newer, kind of almost novel orders of complexity. And so it raised an interesting question that if certain systems naturally, just chemical stuff, self-organizes and it can turn into a feedback loop or turn into this crystalline complex structure, could that have kind of eventually turned into more and more complex stuff until you had the first self-contained, self-regulating system, which we would call a cell. Okay, and then a cell exhibits that same set of properties, and it reaches a certain point where it again jumps up into a higher order of complexity. And you can start to see how almost like those Russian dolls that nest within one another, you get higher orders of complexity, and eventually that consciousness and what we think of as life would again eventually emerge out of that. Because at the end of the day, pretty much all any living organism is a self-organizing system, right? It's all organized and self-contained, and the system exists to perpetuate itself, right? It takes in food and water, it passes out waste, right? And it maintains itself far from homeostasis, right? My internal temperature is like 98.6 degrees, and in this room it's 70 degrees. Well, how do you do that? So it may be that there is kind of again, somewhere between like an external designer, higher power, in between just extreme of random chance, maybe there's this kind of connecting piece of not necessarily some person style figure or even conscious in the same way we think, but an inherent, I sometimes call it creative principle or design principle that's fundamental in the universe itself that allows for some of these self-organizing tendencies and this jumping up into higher orders of complexity that will eventually kind of evolve or manifest into conscious awareness. So again, this is all just, I think, a very interesting discussion, which will leave you some food for thought to think about as you think about your own life and your own beliefs. But the last thing I'll share is a potential connection here for, again, happiness is William James, I think one of the most profound psychologists. He was early 1900s, I believe, early 1900s. He said something that sticks with me. He said, the truth is what works. The truth is what works. In other words, a lot of times our beliefs, right, with the exception of things that say, oh, well, the sky is red. Like, no, it's not. So we're not talking about delusion here. But generally, we're talking about certain beliefs that can lead us to more suffering or less suffering. So again, a better example is one that's slightly more subjective. If I say like, oh, I'm such an idiot. Okay, maybe that's true. I've done plenty of stupid things in my life, but that belief is not really serving me very well. Okay. Whereas if I say, you know what, I am a great learner, that's going to motivate me to be more effective in my life and probably have a lot less suffering. Am I an idiot? Am I a learner? Like, it's kind of subjective, but the truth is what works. In this case, what works best for me is to believe I am a learner. And so I've heard Carl Jung, famous psychologist, also talk about this, where in many of the patients that he treated for psychological illnesses, the common theme amongst all of them, the ones who made a full recovery or to got back to optimal mental health and flourishing and well-being, he said pretty much all of them had some sort of spiritual or religious philosophy. Even if it wasn't traditional, like in his context would be like Christianity, even if it was something else, they all had some kind of faith in a higher power or some bigger picture or designer. And so again, that's maybe a final perspective is there a way to reconcile these two things in a way that best serves you? Because I certainly think if you pause for a moment and think of religion and spirituality less as like a literal thing of I'm interpreting the universe was made by this special power, and we interpret it as like a psychological tool to help you understand and cope with the world, it may be that religion and philosophy and beliefs like this and some design or some bigger picture or some higher power may actually be a source of resiliency and a source of coherence and a source of ultimately like peace, intellectual peace, when it comes to your ability to reconcile the inevitable challenges and suffering and confusion that comes with being a human being. Because I will admit, sometimes it's really hard to think that we are just sitting a little blue and green dot marble in the middle of an entire infinite universe of darkness, and we're not even at the center of it. There's tons of stuff going on everywhere, and it's like, this is, I'm going to be here for like a blink of an eye, and then I'm going to disappear. That is, whether you're scientific or not, or you agree or disagree, certainly it's not always the most comfortable thing to believe in, right? And so, again, I'm not going to advise you to do one or the other. I just hope that this has been a kind of an interesting and maybe a spirited philosophical conversation when we think about, well, are there some, I think, reasonable and quite rational arguments that could suggest that there is a higher power or some sort of designer or what we may think of as a god or spiritual force. Of course, I think there's some really valid criticisms and arguments in opposition to that. And I think there's some merit in investigating these concepts for yourself and how can you integrate whatever side you're on in that spectrum, how can you integrate those beliefs into your life in a way that helps you to ultimately cope with reality and to live in a way where you are happy and you're having a positive impact on other people? Because as William James said, the truth is what works. Okay, whatever your model or your construct of reality is true to you. So as long as it is not totally delusional and it doesn't involve hurting yourself or other people, in many ways it may make sense to run with that belief. So there you have it. This has been, again, maybe a little less of the science side of things, but some science in there. But I always like to ask interesting questions, right? What are these big questions that have an impact on our life? So I hope you've enjoyed this short discussion. I would love to know what you think about this topic. We could maybe start a friendly, emphasis on the friendly, because I know I'm on social media, a friendly debate on this topic. And I would love to hear, your side of this argument, or if you're like me, somewhat in the middle of maybe there's some sort of inherent self-organizing principle in the universe, which to me is a beautiful reconciliation of the more creationist take versus the more non-creationist take. So that is all for now. Here's a video that YouTube suggests you'll like. As always on this channel, you'll find me asking and answering, in many cases, questions from the art and science of happiness study. So thank you for watching. This has been Jackson Kirchis, and I'll see you next time.